In the news tonight, His Majesty the King calls for intensifying British efforts to set the ground for the resumption of peace negotiations between Palestinians and Israel during a call with the British Prime Minister that focused on Israel's assault on Gaza. Israel strikes Gaza in what it claims was a retaliation for rockets fired from the enclave in renewed fighting that puts talks in Cairo on a long-term ceasefire in jeopardy. And Iraqi forces halt an offensive to recapture Tikrit due to fierce resistance from Islamic militants who have threatened to attack Americans in any place. Good evening and welcome to a new edition of the news. Here are the details. His Majesty the King and British Prime Minister David Cameron discussed a number of Middle East issues, mainly developments in Gaza and efforts to reach an end to Israel's assault on the besieged enclave. In a telephone conversation, His Majesty called for intensifying British, European, as well as international efforts to set the ground for the resumption of peace negotiations that address all final status issues, according to the two-state solution and international legitimacy resolutions. The King warned of the consequences of provocative Israeli actions in Jerusalem against Islamic and Christian sanctities and said they threaten efforts to bring about a just and comprehensive peace in the region. On Syria, King Abdullah renewed Jordan's support for a comprehensive political solution to the Syria crisis and pointed to the repercussions of the crisis on neighboring countries and the region as a whole. He also voiced Jordan's support to all measures which guarantee the unity and cohesion of the Iraqi people. King Abdullah told Cameron that the continuation of the violence, turmoil and instability in the region fuels extremism and terrorism and threatens the security and stability of the region and its peoples. Israel launched attacks in the Gaza Strip and recalled its negotiators from truce talks in Cairo after they accused Palestinians of firing rockets on southern Israel hours before a fresh ceasefire was due to expire. An Israeli aircraft was seen firing a missile east of Gaza City, wounding 2 children. The fresh Israeli flare-up spurred a new exodus of dozens of Palestinian families who had fled previous fighting and returned home only days ago.
The new 24-hour truce between Israel and the Palestinians seems to have fallen apart just hours before a ceasefire was due to expire. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu ordered Israeli military to strike what he called terror targets in the Strip after 3 rockets from the Palestinian enclave struck southern Israel. A military spokeswoman said the rockets landed in open areas near the city of Beer-Sheba with no reports of casualties. Despite an agreement which was struck yesterday to extend the ceasefire by 24 hours, Palestinian and Israeli negotiators are taking the talks, obviously, to nowhere. The Palestinians are demanding an end to the Egyptian and Israeli blockades of the economically crippled Strip. They insist any agreement must meet the basic demands and needs of Palestinians.
حتى هذه اللحظة لم يحصل أي تقدم.
Up until this moment, there is no progress and the situation is getting more complicated. We have presented the Palestinian delegation's final position to our Egyptian brothers approximately 2 hours ago. Up until this moment, we are waiting for the final answer regarding the final position that we have presented. The Israeli delegation, and maybe you have followed the statements of the Israeli Prime Minister, are up until now are trying to force what they want. This is impossible to accept as Palestinians.
But for Israel, Hamas forms a security threat and wants guarantees any removal of border restrictions will not result in the group obtaining weapons. An Israeli official said Israel's delegation had been instructed to insist at the talks that its security requirements be met. But Hamas again insisted that laying down its weapons is not an option and blamed Israel for talks faltering. Another condition in the talks brings Israeli and Palestinian delegates at odds. A senior Palestinian official in Gaza said sticking points to an agreement were Hamas's demands to build a seaport and an airport, which Israel wants to discuss only at a later stage. Palestinian officials held more meetings today with Egyptian mediators, and contrary to Israel's announcement of recalling its negotiating team from Cairo, an Israeli government official said Israeli delegates were still in Cairo, poring over details of a possible deal. An agreement would open the way for reconstruction aid to begin to flow to the Gaza Strip, where thousands of homes have been destroyed in the conflict. Rad Plush for the news at 10.
In Moscow, meanwhile, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov held a round of talks with chief Palestinian negotiator Saeb Erekat that focused on ending the war on Gaza. Erekat is in Russia to discuss methods of approaching a lasting peaceful settlement with Israel. Lavrov said the situation in and around Gaza is very disturbing, adding that Russia is undertaking efforts to support the Egyptian initiative. Following talks with Lavrov, Erekat addressed a news conference in which he called on the United Nations Security Council, along with the international community, to set a time frame for Israeli troops to pull out of the occupied territories. His comments come as new fighting erupts in Gaza.
Today, we demand officially from the international community and the UN Security Council to adopt a resolution that would set a time frame for the withdrawal of Israeli troops from territories occupied in 1967.
Iraqi forces halted a short-lived offensive to recapture Tikrit due to fierce resistance from Islamic State fighters who have also threatened to attack Americans in any place. Iraqi army units backed by Shiite militias launched their offensive shortly after dawn on Tikrit, north of Baghdad, which is a stronghold of the Sunni Muslim minority. But officers in the Iraqi forces operations room said by mid-afternoon the advance had stopped. South of Tikrit, the government side came under heavy machine gun and mortar fire from the militants, and to the west, landmines and snipers frustrated efforts to get closer to the city center, and the latest in a series of attempts to drive out the militants. Meantime, Kurdish Peshmerga forces who recaptured the two towns of Mahmoud and Guer from IS in northern Iraq last week said they were in control, though IS militants weren't far away. The Peshmerga forces were optimistic they could push on and recapture more towns and villages from IS. In Geneva, the United Nations Refugee Agency said it was launching a major aid operation to get supplies to more than 500,000 people displaced by fighting in northern Iraq. Hundreds of thousands have fled their homes since fighters led by the militant Islamic State group swept through much of the north and west of Iraq in June, threatening to break up the country. A 4-day airlift of tents, plastic sheets for shelter, kitchen sets and other goods will begin tomorrow to Erbil from the port city of Aqaba, followed by road convoys from Turkey and Jordan and sea shipments from Dubai. The UNHCR estimates that a total of 1.2 million have fled their homes across Iraq this year.
The major focus of this push is on improving living conditions for the displaced in the region, particularly people without shelter or housing. Conditions remain desperate for those without access to suitable shelter, for people struggling to find food and water to feed their families, and for those without access to primary medical care. Many are still coming to grips with the tragedy they've been through in recent weeks, fleeing homes with nothing, and many are trying to cope with the loss of loved ones. Emergency support is an urgent need that we are trying to meet. Iraq's current humanitarian challenges are immense. Most of the displaced are still living in schools, mosques, churches, unfinished buildings and elsewhere.
A specially equipped U.S. ship has finished neutralizing all 600 metric tons of the most dangerous of Syria's chemical weapons components surrendered to international community this year to avert threatened airstrikes. A Pentagon spokeswoman said the Cape Ray vessel will travel to Finland and Germany in the next 2 weeks to unload the resulting effluent, which will undergo treatment as industrial waste to render it safer. She added that this is the first time chemical weapons components had been neutralized at sea. Damascus agreed last September to a Russian proposal to give up its chemical weapons to avert threatened military strikes by the U.S. and France. A number of countries are involved in eliminating the stockpiles. Libyan militiamen fired rockets into an affluent district of Tripoli, moving a battle with rival armed factions closer to the center of the capital. Unidentified militiamen fired Grad rockets into the Hayy, Andalus and Garish districts, neighborhoods home to the Libyan Bourse, cafes and brand outlets. At least 3 people were killed and 8 wounded. The fighting took place after an air force yesterday controlled by renegade General Khalifa Haftar struck militia fighters. Tripoli has largely slipped out of control of the government, with senior officials working from Tobruk in the Far East, where the new parliament has based itself to escape street fighting. London's iconic clock tower, Big Ben, is getting a makeover by a team of abseilers, while other experts carry out maintenance on the mechanics inside. The team of abseilers traversed down the first of 4 clock faces to give it a good scrub. The faces of the clock are each made of 312 pieces of pot opal glass, which are all framed in iron. Big Ben is the nickname of the bell of the clock tower of the Palace of Westminster. The clock tower itself has been known as the Elizabeth Tower since it was renamed in commemoration of Queen Elizabeth during her Diamond Jubilee year in 2012. A working week has been set aside for the project, after which the clock hands of the historic tower will once again tell the correct time. Real Madrid are hoping to take advantage of playing the first leg of the Spanish Super Cup against city rivals Atletico at home in order to increase the chances of winning the trophy on Friday. In tonight's match, which is in less than 2 hours, Iker Casillas will be goalkeeper. The return leg of the Spanish Super Cup is at the Vicente Calderón on Friday, 3 days before Atletico start the defense of their title at Rayo Vallecano. Real also opened their league campaign on Monday against Córdoba. Luis Suarez was officially presented as new Barcelona player, while he is still banned for biting Giorgio Chiellini in Uruguay's World Game with Italy. The striker was initially banned from all football activities for 4 months, but an appeal hearing last week allowed him to train with Barca and play friendlies, but will not be allowed to play a competitive game for his new club until after his ban ends at the end of October. Suarez turned out in his new Barca kit at the new camp yesterday for a friendly against Mexico's club Leon that Barca won 6-0. Suarez played in the final 14 minutes. Lionel Messi opened the scoring after just 3 minutes. Neymar had 2 goals. Munir El-Haddadi scored 2 goals and Sandro Ramirez 1. And finally, fair weather continues tonight with northwesterly moderate winds. Tomorrow, relatively hot conditions are expected in most parts of the kingdom, while winds will be northwesterly moderate. In the Gulf of Aqaba, it will be very hot with temperatures above 40 degrees Celsius, northerly moderate to brisk winds and calm seas. Here now is the look at temperatures forecast for tonight and tomorrow. And to close, his reminder of the day's top stories. His Majesty the King calls for intensifying British efforts to set the ground for the resumption of peace negotiations between the Palestinians and Israel during a call with the British Prime Minister that focused on Israel's assault on Gaza. Israel strikes Gaza in what it claims was a retaliation for rockets fired from the enclave in renewed fighting that puts talks in Cairo on a long-term ceasefire in jeopardy. And Iraqi forces halt an offensive to recapture Tikrit due to fierce resistance from Islamic militants who have threatened to attack Americans in any place. And with this, we come to the end of this edition of the news. I'm Touqan. Thank you for joining us and have a good night.